The ashes in the brazier are cold, but his skin is hot like desert glass. A young attendant, barely tall enough to see over the general's massive campaign desk, whispered the observation to a senior centurion standing guard. General Marcus Vindex, the celebrated victor who crushed the Sarmatian rebellion, sat utterly motionless in the center of his opulent atrium. He was still wearing the mud-stained military cloak from the Danube crossing, weeks after his triumphal return. The city demanded his immediate presence at the Senate, but Vindex had not stirred since the second watch of the night. The boy trembled, clutching a bronze scroll case. The air was thick, not with the smell of victory, but with exhaustion so profound it felt like a plague. If the iron fist of Rome's protection failed now, the fragile peace would collapse entirely. Marcus Vindex did not move, but the city moved around him. Messengers of the Senate came and went, their sandals scratching the polished marble floor, carrying pleas and threats regarding the political distribution of the captured Sarmatian gold. Tribunes nervously detailed troop movements, discussing the next punitive expedition into Germania. Generals waited hours for an audience, hoping to glean some strategic insight from the man who had fought 17 continuous battles without a single major defeat. Vindex was the law, the shield, the relentless will of Rome embodied in 300 pounds of muscle and scar tissue. His routine, even in the heart of the capital, was starkly military. He rose before dawn not for religious observance, but for the grueling regimen of weighted calisthenics, a necessary cruelty to keep the war from decaying his spirit completely. He ate standing, reviewing casualty reports while consuming the coarse bread and sour wine of a legionary, refusing the delicacies offered by his household staff. Authority radiated from him not through loud commands, but through the crushing weight of his silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, gravel rumble that demanded immediate, absolute compliance. Today, however, he had done nothing but sit. He looked at the scroll case on his desk, not the one the Senate sent, but a small, worn wooden case. It had arrived 3 days prior, delivered by a frantic courier from the eastern provinces, but Vindex had not yet touched it. He knew the seal. It was the mark of his brother, Lucius, a minor magistrate stationed near the Syrian border, a posting that was essentially exile, arranged by Vindex himself after Lucius's disastrous gambling debts and questionable political associations. Vindex had maintained the facade of family connection, but the truth was a cold, bitter knot in his gut. Lucius had always been weak, prone to indulgence and desperate for approval, everything Vindex was trained to despise. Vindex, the stern, dutiful older brother, had felt the weight of pietas, duty to family, as a heavy chain. He had protected Lucius's life, but he had systematically destroyed his reputation and isolated him to prevent a greater scandal from staining the family name. This was the true, deep wound Marcus carried, the realization that to serve Rome absolutely, he had been forced to extinguish the life of his own blood, keeping him alive but rendering him irrelevant. He had chosen the legion over the lineage. His gaze drifted to the window overlooking the Forum, the cheering crowds, the banners, the intoxicating noise of Rome celebrating its savior. It all felt distant, hollow. He had slaughtered thousands to guarantee this peace, but the quiet of his own house was louder than any battlefield. A small, almost imperceptible tremor ran through his hand, resting on the hilt of his short sword. He feared the contents of that small scroll case more than a barbarian charge. Lucius did not write unless he needed rescuing, and Vindex was tired of being the rescuer of fools. Yet the honor of the family, however disgraced, still demanded attention. Marcus Vindex was the pinnacle of Rome's power, but he was drowning in the guilt of choosing duty over love, a choice he repeated every morning he woke up and put on the heavy armor. Lyra spent her days among the soot and sweat of the Phallonica, the laundry and dye house near the Tiber docks. She was a freedwoman, her manumission papers fragile but real, allowing her to work the punishing hours necessary to keep her meager room rented in the Subura slums. Her life was defined by the caustic smell of lye and urine, the aching burn in her arms from scrubbing heavy woolen tunics, and the desperate scarcity of time. Lyra was socially invisible, one of the countless cogs in the imperial machinery that kept the senators and generals in clean white togas. Fear was her closest companion, the fear of a misplaced word, the fear of debt, the fear of the harsh Roman knight. But Lyra had a strength few saw, her focus on her small, sickly younger brother, Cato. He was 10 years old, frail from a recurring lung ailment, and utterly dependent on the small wages she earned. Cato was why she endured the endless demands, the occasional cruelty of the fulons as laundry workers, and the suffocating pressure of her existence. He was the soft light in her hard world, a tiny scholar who devoured the discarded papyrus scraps she managed to bring home, dreaming of a life beyond the vats. She protected him fiercely, hiding him from the harsh realities of the city, sacrificing her own rest and food to ensure he had medicine and a small piece of bread. Today, Lyra was tasked with a job of unusual prestige, retrieving and cleaning the personal garments of General Vindex's household. She and 2 other workers were escorted, under the stern gaze of a military guard, into the immense, silent villa. She moved quickly, her eyes lowered, acutely aware of the chasm separating her life from this unbearable luxury. As she bundled the heavy cloaks and linens into baskets, she noticed the general himself, sitting stone still in the atrium, looking like a monument already weathered by time. While securing a heavy crimson-dyed tunic belonging to an aide, she found something nestled deep within the lining near the shoulder seam. It was a folded piece of rough, dark parchment, sealed with a distinctive yet unfamiliar ring. Curiosity, stronger than her ingrained fear, made her hesitate. She slipped the parchment into her sleeve, as the centurion momentarily turned his back to exchange pleasantries with a house slave. It was a risky, foolish move, potentially punishable by the loss of her hard-won freedom, or worse. Later, while cleaning the garment back at the Fullonica, she would carefully break the seal. The writing inside was not a letter, it was a list, names and dates, cryptic markers, and at the bottom a single devastating reference to the Sarmatian gold diversion. Lyra knew about gold diversions only from street rumors. They meant theft from the imperial treasury, a crime that led directly to crucifixion. She knew she shouldn't have seen it, and she definitely knew it involved Vindex's inner circle, but she did not yet grasp the magnitude of the lie this small piece of parchment concealed. Tell me, where are you watching from today? The following evening, the lives of Marcus Vindex and Lyra crossed in a way neither would acknowledge, driven by the hidden weights they carried. Vindex finally broke his vigil, not to address the Senate, but to escape the suffocating walls of his own fame. He put on simple, heavy civilian clothes, a dark, unadorned toga, and left through a servant's entrance, dismissing his usual Praetorian escort. He needed air, not the political kind, but the rough, unfiltered breath of the city that he had bled to save. He walked the dark, winding streets of the Subura, the district where the poor and the desperate lived, the smells of cheap wine and open sewage assaulting his senses. He did not seek debauchery or distraction. He sought the anonymity of the forgotten masses, a place where General Vindex ceased to exist, replaced by a ghost of a man wrestling with his conscience. Lyra, meanwhile, was rushing home, the list of names burned into her memory, the parchment safely tucked beneath the loose floorboard of her room. The Fullonica had demanded 12 hours that day, and her muscles protested every hurried step. She carried a single precious oil lamp, its light barely piercing the oppressive gloom of the alleyways. She was acutely aware of the danger the document represented. It suggested not just corruption, but a high-level conspiracy to embezzle the wartime treasury, implicating men close to the general. If the list fell into the wrong hands, it would not just mean trouble. It would mean the total destruction of the fragile peace Vindex had won. Vindex rounded a corner sharply, his pace rapid, his mind replaying the harsh letter he had finally read from his brother Lucius, a final plea for immense funds, claiming ruin and threatening to expose old family secrets to save himself. It was blackmail, subtle, but unmistakable. Lyra stumbled, her exhaustion overcoming her at the exact moment Vindex emerged from the shadow of an insular apartment block. She did not see a famous general. She saw a large, powerful man blocking the narrow path. Fear spiked instantly. She clutched her lamp tighter, shrinking into the damp wall. Vindex, unused to navigating the chaos of the lower city, stopped short. He registered the small, terrified woman with the worn tunic and the haunted eyes. He saw the sheer physical exhaustion radiating from her, a weariness deeper than his own wartime fatigue. He saw in her not weakness, but the grinding, endless struggle of those who lived without the protection of the legions or the Senate. For a fleeting second, their eyes met. Lyra quickly averted hers, a gesture of submission and fear drilled into her from birth. Vindex felt a strange, involuntary pull, a recognition of raw, exposed vulnerability. He stepped aside without a word, his massive presence momentarily dwarfing the alley. Lyra hurried past, her heart hammering against her ribs, unaware she had just brushed shoulders with the man who commanded Rome's legions. Vindex watched her disappear into the dark, a cold foreign feeling settling in his chest, a momentary empathy that was deeply unsettling. He was supposed to focus on his traitorous brother and the burden of the Empire, yet the image of her fear lingered. Something was already out of his control, not on the battlefield, but here, in the dark heart of the city, where power collided silently with desperation. The heavy parchment burned Lyra's conscience worse than the lie had burned her hands. For 2 days, she obsessively studied the names on the list, trying to match the Roman titles to faces she had glimpsed at the docks or near the Forum. Most were obscure functionaries, minor accountants, logistics clerks, and one surprising inclusion, Titus Gallus, a revered veteran centurion now serving as the general's personal aide-de-camp. This was the detail that jarred her, the sign that screamed incoherence. Titus Gallus was famously loyal, a man whose honor was believed to be as unbending as his steel helmet. Why would he be associated with a plan to divert the Sarmatian war funds? Everyone else in the city, from the Senate floor to the taverns, saw General Vindex as the bastion of integrity, his victory the ultimate proof of Rome's righteous strength. The thought of corruption reaching into his inner sanctum was unthinkable, but the parchment, it felt real, heavy, and terrifyingly precise. Lyra's initial instinct was pure self-preservation. Burn the evidence, forget the names, protect Cato. Her small brother resting his fevered head on a worn cushion was the only justification she needed for silence. If she went to the authorities, they would either dismiss her as a hysterical freedwoman or worse, investigate her for possession of sensitive documents, assuming she was a spy or a thief. The Empire did not protect the invisible, it crushed them. Yet, a small, stubborn voice persisted in her mind, fed by the haunting image of the general sitting alone in his massive hall. She had seen him as a broken man, not a triumphant god. The list suggested the conspiracy was designed to frame Vindex, to siphon funds under the cover of his authority, leaving him either complicit or looking negligent. If the truth about the missing gold emerged during the political maneuvering in the Senate, Vindex, despite his power, could fall, dragging the fragile stability of the empire with him. Rome could not afford chaos now. The barbarian tribes were only temporarily subdued. She watched Titus Gallus one morning, lingering near the general's villa gates. He stood impeccably straight, his eyes scanning the street with professional alertness. But Lyra noticed something in the way Gallus addressed a low-ranking legionary, a slight, almost imperceptible arrogance, a flicker of entitlement that contradicted the stoic humility expected of a loyal centurion. He dismissed the soldier with a casual wave of his hand, a ring flashing on his finger. Lyra remembered the seal on the original parchment, the design of the ring. It matched. The confluence of the detailed list, the involvement of the aide, and the sudden, chilling memory of the general's deep exhaustion fueled her internal storm. Was Vindex a victim or the mastermind? The risk of exposure was too great, but the thought of letting this injustice proceed, potentially leading to instability that would hurt the thousands of people like her and Cato, paralyzed her. The burden of this deadly secret was far heavier than any basket of wet laundry. She had to decide if she could live with the knowledge that she had chosen silence over truth, even if the truth meant her own certain doom. The cold realization that Titus Gallus was involved solidified Lyra's resolve. The centurion was the general's shadow, his trusted right hand. Any attempt to go to the authorities would be instantly funneled back to Gallus, sealing her fate. She could not denounce him, but she could circumvent him. Her only option was to reach Vindex himself, a feat that felt as impossible as scaling the Capitoline Hill barehanded. She knew Vindex's schedule, early morning training in the general's private courtyard before the Senate delegations arrived. It was the only time he was slightly separated from Gallus, who managed the incoming dispatches. Lyra took a full day's wage, 3 silver denarii, and bought a small thick stylus and a square of fresh wax tablet, items far too expensive for her usual budget. She meticulously transcribed the names and the key details of the Sarmatian gold diversion plan, avoiding any mention of how she obtained the information, knowing the original parchment was too dangerous to carry. She wrapped the tablet in a piece of clean linen from the Polonica, staining it subtly with the general's household markings to imply it was a forgotten item from the laundry. Before dawn, Lyra positioned herself near the high outer wall of Vindex's villa, hidden behind a merchant's cart overflowing with olives. The air was frigid, the silence heavy with the anticipation of the city's waking roar. She waited, heart pounding for the movement of the guards, her eyes fixed on the small, barred window of the general's personal training room. Finally, she saw a flicker of torchlight and heard the muffled, rhythmic thud of a heavy punching bag. Vindex was beginning his brutal workout. Gallus was nowhere in sight yet. He would be coordinating the morning reports inside. This was her single desperate chance. Taking a breath that tasted like pure terror, Lyra ran. She darted across the deserted lane, moving low to the ground, relying on the cloak of pre-dawn shadow. A sleepy junior guard patrolling the perimeter turned his head just as she reached the wall. "Halt! Who is there?" the guard demanded, raising his spear. Lyra didn't halt. She hurled the linen-wrapped tablet toward the open window, putting all her desperate energy into the throw. It sailed through the narrow gap and struck the wall of the training room with a loud, distinct thwack, falling onto the stone floor near the general's feet. The guard immediately raised the alarm, shouting in alarm. Lyra was already sprinting back toward the shadows, disappearing into the maze of the Subura before the guard could even reach the spot. Inside, Vindex paused his heavy exertion. Sweat streamed down his face, blurring his vision, but the sound was sharp, unnatural. He looked down at the floor, seeing the small white bundle lying near the weights. It was an anonymous intrusion, an obvious risk, yet the linen bore the faint scent of his own household's washing. He picked it up slowly, his powerful hand crushing the soft cloth. He knew instantly that this trivial object was a deliberate act, a message delivered with lethal precision by someone risking everything. The general felt the atmosphere in the room solidify into a silence heavier than any he had experienced on the frontier. The history of Rome had just pivoted on a single thrown piece of wax. Marcus Vindex did not move for a long moment, the sweat cooling rapidly on his skin. He heard the distant, confused shouts of the guards, but ignored them entirely. He unwrapped the linen and looked at the small wax tablet. The script was precise, formal, and devastating. He read the names once, then a second time, connecting them to the logistics officers he had appointed and the quartermasters he had trusted implicitly with the spoils of the Sarmatian campaign. The term gold diversion was brutal in its simplicity. He crushed the linen in his fist, rage warring with a cold, terrifying clarity. The numbers, the missing sestertii, were too large to be simple corruption. This was a deliberate, structured attempt to destabilize the military economy and potentially fund a political rival. The betrayal was staggering. Worse than the theft was the inclusion of Titus Gallus's name, scrawled ominously at the bottom. Gallus had been with Vindex since the Balkan frontier, saving his life twice. He was the anchor of his command. Vindex summoned Gallus immediately, his voice dangerously low. "The guards report an attempted intrusion. Investigate the perimeter immediately, Centurion. Someone threw something over the wall." Gallus, impeccably dressed and radiating dutiful concern, moved with speed, checking the area Vindex indicated. Vindex watched him, studying the subtle movements of his eyes, the absolute absence of guilt on his face. It was the face of a dedicated soldier, or a masterful actor. "Nothing, General, just a stray dog or perhaps a drunken plebeian," Gallus reported smoothly, returning to the training room. "Did they disturb you?" "They disturbed the foundation of this house, Centurion," Vindex replied, his voice flat. He pointed to the spot where the tablet had landed. "Fetch that cloth lying there. It seems to be part of my laundry." Gallus bent down and picked up the heavy, stained linen. As he unfolded it, Vindex watched the precise moment the Centurion's posture froze. Gallus saw the wax tablet underneath, the writing exposed. For a microsecond, the mask slipped. Raw, panicked comprehension flashed in his eyes before he clamped down on his expression, attempting to reassert control. "General, what is this obscenity?" Gallus stammered, scrambling to cover the tablet with his hand. Vindex moved with the speed of a striking viper. He did not ask, he did not accuse. He simply drew the heavy dagger he kept concealed in his tunic, slamming the hilt against Gallus's temple. Gallus collapsed without a sound, the tablet skittering across the floor. Vindex stood over the unconscious Centurion, his decision made in that instant of confirmation. He could not involve the Senate. The conspiracy was too deep, too close to the imperial coffers, and time was running out. He had only been given one critical advantage: the name of the traitor, delivered by an unknown, terrified hand. He had to assume Gallus was not the head of the serpent, merely its throat. Vindex was now racing against his own public image. He had to solve this treason before the Senate or the conspirators used the accusation of theft to dismantle his political power and plunge Rome into uncertainty. The urgency was total, silent, and internal. The general was back on the warpath, but this time the enemy was wearing his colors. Vindex had Gallus dragged, bound, and gagged to the sub-level chambers beneath the atrium, rarely used except for storing campaign trophies. He left a simple, chilling order with the most trusted mute guard. No one was to enter, and no one was to know the Centurion was missing. When Gallus regained consciousness, the general was waiting. Vindex was still in his soiled training gear, the rage banked into a frightening stillness. He held the wax tablet, tapping it lightly against his armored thigh. "Titus," Vindex began, his voice devoid of warmth, "I saved your life at Nisus. I granted you honor, wealth, and my absolute trust. Tell me, before the sun reaches the zenith, why you decided to break Rome for 3 times the amount of gold you already possess." Gallus, fighting against the ropes digging into his wrists, spat on the stone floor. His fear had curdled into venomous pride. "Rome! You are Rome, Marcus, and Rome feeds only the ambitious. You hoard the power, others merely subsist on the scraps. I took what you neglected, the opportunity." The confession was not a denial, but a justification, a direct strike at Vindex's rigid morality. Gallus revealed that the conspiracy involved diverting the bullion designated for the Roman mint, replacing it with lower-quality alloy, and skimming the difference through a series of shell companies controlled by a powerful, unnamed senator. "Why the list?" Vindex pressed, his eyes narrowing. "Why endanger this entire operation with this reckless accounting?" Gallus laughed, a dry, grating sound. "That was insurance. If the fraud was discovered, those men were ready to testify that you orchestrated the diversion to finance your own political ambitions, General. We would have ruined your honor completely. You would have been exiled, but we would have kept the gold. You are too clean, Marcus, too pious. You believe in the Pax Romana. We believe in the prophet of the Pax Romana." The emotional confrontation was brutal. Vindex felt a physical tearing, the absolute failure of his judgment. He had fought external enemies for decades, but the rot had grown inside his own ranks, fostered by the very wealth his victories had generated. Gallus wasn't just a traitor. He was a mirror reflecting the corruption inherent in absolute power. "Did you consider the cost, Titus? The destabilization? The tribes waiting for us to show weakness?" Vindex demanded. "Cost? Only to the plebeians, Marcus," Gallus sneered. "The people who live in the mud. They are easily replaced, like the laundress who delivered that foolish warning." Vindex's head snapped up. "What laundress?" Gallus realized his error, his eyes widening slightly. "The one who saw too much. Don't worry, General. She's already being dealt with. She lowered her eyes before you, but she sealed her own fate when she decided to play hero." The mention of the terrified woman he had seen in the Subura, the unknown figure who risked everything not for gold, but for an abstract sense of justice, struck Vindex harder than any blow. The mentira of Gallus's loyalty and the larger lie of the conspiracy collapsed entirely, replaced by the grim reality that Vindex's obsession with high-level politics had blinded him to the human cost, both of his soldiers' betrayal and of the innocent life now in danger. Vindex moved with terrifying focus. He left Gallus secured, not bothering with further interrogation. The confession was enough. The priority shifted to the unknown laundress, the key witness and the immediate casualty of Gallus's fear. Through a small network of fiercely loyal, non-commissioned officers, Vindex began a silent investigation. He used the few details Gallus had let slip, tracking the Centurion's hired thugs into the sprawling, congested maze of the Subura. The speed and secrecy of the action were crucial. If the unnamed senator behind the conspiracy learned of Gallus's capture, they would erase the trail and eliminate all evidence, including Lyra. Meanwhile, Lyra was experiencing the full, crushing consequence of her courage. She returned to her room to find it ransacked. Cato was gone. A rough, scarred man had been waiting, grabbing her as soon as she entered. He demanded to know where the original parchment was, detailing her transgression with frightening precision. Gallus had acted fast, immediately sending his hired enforcers after the only person who knew the true list. Lyra, bruised and terrified, refused to reveal the location beneath the floorboard, knowing that parchment was her only leverage. The thug, growing impatient, revealed their true target, Cato. "Your brother goes to the docks. He has a fever and can barely stand. Tell us where the list is, or he will be lost at sea by sunrise," the enforcer grated, shoving Lyra to the floor. Vindex's small team arrived just as Lyra was being dragged toward the dark alleyway. There was no exchange of words, only the swift, brutal action of veteran soldiers executing a quiet, necessary skirmish. The confrontation was brief and deadly. Vindex's men, driven by the knowledge they were protecting their general's honor, dispatched the thugs quickly. The rupture in Vindex's life was complete. He had lost his most trusted aide, a necessary sacrifice to root out the treason. His relationship with the Senate was now compromised. Relying entirely on his ability to retrieve the missing gold and expose the unnamed conspirator without causing an imperial panic. The price of truth was already monumental, the destruction of his professional reputation and the realization that his command was porous. Vindex found Lyra huddled and shaking. She was injured but alive. His officer reported that Cato had been moved toward the docks. Vindex looked at Lyra, seeing not a humble worker, but a woman whose desperate courage had saved Rome from itself. He gave a single, sharp command to his most reliable tribune, Cassius. "Take this woman, secure her, and protect her. Then find the boy, bring him to my house. The time for caution is over. We move on the senator now." Lyra stared at the legendary general, unable to process the whirlwind of violence and rescue. Her act of courage had cost her freedom and nearly her life, but it had bought her protection from the most powerful man in Rome. Justice was not delivered by the state, but by a powerful man forced to see the truth through the eyes of the forgotten. The exposure of the Sarmatian gold diversion plot ripped through the Senate, but Vindex, having secured the original parchment from Lyra's hiding place and using Gallus's coerced testimony, moved faster than his enemies. Within 2 weeks, the senator behind the scheme, a long-time rival obsessed with undermining Vindex, was publicly disgraced, his assets seized, and the vast majority of the stolen bullion recovered. Vindex lost political goodwill, viewed by many peers as ruthless and paranoid, but his honor before the legions and the common people was restored, elevated by his swift, brutal execution of justice against the corrupt elite. Lyra and Cato were now lodged within the protective walls of Vindex's compound. They were not prisoners nor servants, but protected witnesses. The transformation in their lives was profound. Cato, nursed by Vindex's personal physician, began to thrive, spending his days reading scrolls in the massive library, no longer constrained by the toxic air of the Subura. Vindex, relieved of the military threat and the festering internal rot, began to shed the cloak of exhaustion. He had faced the truth of his own blind spots. That power required not just strength, but constant vigilance against internal decay, and that true loyalty often resided where he least expected it. He sat in his atrium again, But this time the silence felt less like a tomb and more like a foundation. One cool morning, Lyra found Vindex standing by the window, looking out over the city he protected. She approached him cautiously, carrying a simple cup of cool water, a habit she couldn't break. "General," she said softly, maintaining the ingrained subservience, "Cato is much better. He asks if he might one day study the maps of the provinces you have conquered." Vindex turned, his gaze heavy but clear. He saw the resilience in her eyes. "Lyra," he stated, dropping the formality, "you risked everything, not for family, but for an idea of Rome that most men in the Senate have forgotten. You are no longer under my protection merely as a witness. You saved my command, and by extension, the city." He did not offer her gold or a grand title. Instead, he made her a simple, profound offer of dignity. He arranged for her to manage the record-keeping and correspondence for the household, a position requiring literacy and trust, granting her stability and independence. Cato would receive the best education the empire could offer, not as charity, but as recompense for his sister's sacrifice. Lyra lowered her eyes not out of fear, but reverence for the transformation of this man and the unexpected grace he offered. She had lost her anonymity, but she had gained a future, purchased not with coin, but with a terrifying act of conscience. Rome had survived, not because of the general's strength, but because a humble laundress refused to let the lie stand. The peace was fragile, but the hope it contained, centered on a small, learning boy and a woman who had found her voice, was real. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales like this one.